recording now. There we go.
Mark Smith.
Hi guys, how are you doing? So welcome to the second Drum Education Live podcast, and we're really lucky today to have the amazing Pete Cater as a guest. How's it going, Pete? So for those of you who don't know Pete, he's probably the top jazz drummer in the UK, certainly one of the top jazz drummers in the UK. He's got a book out at the moment. Do you want to show us your book? Cool. And we're going to get Pete to talk a little bit about that in a minute. So Pete, tell us a little bit about yourself, your drumming, when you started.
Well, unusually, I really have literally been around this all of my life. There was never a time when drums were not part of my life. My dad played, and he was a very, very good semi-pro drummer in the Midlands, and he would gig most nights of the week as well as having a day job, because back then there was relatively little traffic on the road, so you could actually do that. You could finish your desk job at 5 o'clock, go home, get your drums, go back into the city and do a gig. And it's what people did. And he had great jazz records. I must have heard Joe Morello before I was 1 or 2 weeks old. And, that was like really, really popular music at that time. The Brubeck Quartet, and because of the music that he listened to, I, in my very kind of childish way, just thought that whatever. I think if I can express this in a broader way, I think whatever kind of home environment you have when you're a very, very small child, you tend to think that everybody else lives in exactly the same way as you do. You have no idea that certain children grow up in circumstances of great privilege, and some children grow up in terrible circumstances. But all I knew when I was little, before I started going to school, all I knew about was drums and jazz records and Joe Morello and Ed Thigpen and Philly Joe Jones and Gene Krupa. I didn't really get into Buddy Rich until I was about 5, because he just wasn't kind of around. He didn't really have a profile on the scene in the UK until that time, until he first came over here in 1967, and that was a huge moment. I started hearing those records get played in the house all the time, and then I actually saw him on television, and that was a real kind of real kind of eureka moment, because I'd heard all these guys play, but I'd never actually seen, and seen maybe still pictures of them in books or magazines, but I'd never actually seen this thing being done. And that was so powerful. And now we've got YouTube, we've got Instagram, we've got TikTok, we've got whatever, and all this stuff is so readily available. There was, I think younger people have to understand that there was a time when it wasn't, and these artists would come on mainstream television, because mainstream television used to deal with stuff like that back in the 1960s and 70s, and the American artists as well as the British artists, of course, would go out on the road and they would play live shows, and we'd go and see them play, and we would watch them play. This is important, in real time. And there was no pointing your phone at the stage. And you had to get what you could get. We didn't even have until really to the beginning of the 1980s. And I'm actually going to post an old clip of me from BBC local news from 1980. I'm going to share that again on social media today, because I was just thinking about it an hour ago, that it's 40 years old, and a friend of mine had a VHS machine, so he was able to take that off air for me and subsequently copy it for me. And then in the 80s, that was when it all changed. And the first Steve Gadd video was a complete game changer for me and for many others, when you could actually sit and watch these guys over and over and over again. And that, I think, was really the beginning of when the whole worldwide drummer community really, really started to get good. I don't think there are necessarily any more players now than there were. It's just everyone's visible through, you know, Instagram and things like that. I can remember in Birmingham when I was, you know, young and really interested and excited and finding out so much stuff. There were lots and lots of drum stores, and they were all, you know, all full of, you know, Ludwig and Premier and Gretsch and Slingerland, and you know, we didn't have words like Pearl and Tama and Yamaha. You know, well, Yamaha was a cheap set, the sort of entry to intermediate level. We didn't have those words in our vocabulary back then. It was all British and American product, and you know, there were in just in the centre of Birmingham alone, there were at least half a dozen shops with loads and loads of drum sets. And so, you know, don't tell me there are more players now. There are more better players now. There are more well-informed players. There are more knowledgeable players. There are more players now who are capable of attaining a standard that means that they can go and gig at a professional level, or maybe just at one level below professional level, because of the marvelous availability of information that, you know, we as 21st century drummers have at our disposal, and it wasn't always like that. And I think it's really, really important for people to remember, because I mean, you know, I know you guys both know me personally, and we've met on a number of occasions. You know, I'm quite tall, and I got to be quite tall quite early when I was about 13. So from that age onwards, I would perfectly pass as an adult, and I was able to go with my dad to his gigs, you know, in licensed premises. And you know, people were pretty tough about things like that back then. And lots of these places, the hotels and the clubs, there'd be often two bands working maybe in the same room, playing alternate sets or in different rooms. And one of the things that was just part of what you did was you would go and check out the other band, you know, on your break. And a lot of the drummers who were playing then, you know, they were playing, but they had nothing like the ability or knowledge that their contemporary counterparts would have now. But there was still a lot of work to be had, and I don't think, in a lot of ways, that has changed as much as people might have you believe. It's just that the goalposts have moved, and it's tougher now because there are way more capable players. I can remember when in the late 80s, when I was in my early to middle 20s, I started breaking out of the local scene in the Midlands, and started. You occasionally would go and audition for like cruise ships and holiday centre gigs. A lot of times, things like that, you didn't even need to audition. People would just take you on trust. But you go and do an audition, and you'd play like the first chorus of a song or something, and they'd start to say, "Look, do you want a job?" And it was that easy. If you were even, I mean, I wasn't back then any kind of other than very average pop or groove player back at that time. I hadn't really developed that side of my playing. But to have enough to just people, you know, they offer you a job on the spot, just gives you a bit of an insight into how it was back then.
Cool. Kira, was there anything you wanted to ask?
I wanted to hear about your book, and also while you were talking, I was wondering, you were talking about seeing Buddy Rich on TV.
Yeah.
Do you remember what it was? What show it was?
Yeah, well, I do absolutely. It was well, there were a number of things. There was a program on. I can't remember which was the first one, but because I know a lot of the chronology, it was probably Jazz Scene on BBC Two in 1968.
That's so
60.
cool.
Yeah, it was 68, I think, because it was because they were all done at Ronnie Scott's, and it was right at the time that Ronnie Scott's expanded, because the way Ronnie's is now is it's like two buildings. It used to be one, and Buddy's band was one of the first things that got recorded. Although thinking about it, I think those shows were recorded in 1960. So that was probably the first one ever. So the one that really had the most impact was when he appeared on a kids show called Magpie a couple of years later. And it was like, I remember, and it was just him, no band. He just, and a friend of mine is very much tapped into the whole television archive thing of what things still exist. And sadly, that one is no longer out there. But I just remember after seeing that, and I was a little bit older, I was probably about 9. As soon as the program finished, I just dashed upstairs and started to play the drums. And when my dad came home a little bit later, my mum said to him, "He's going to be a drummer," and she was not saying that from she was saying it more from a sort of mild despair than enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Love it.
But no, it was very powerful because you weren't being bombarded by stuff all the time. There wasn't, content everywhere you look on. There was no internet. We had television, radio, and records, and books and magazines. That was it. It was okay. It was fine. It worked. And speaking of books, did someone say book?
They did, yes.
Okay, well, what can I tell you?
Who is this book for?
Who's it for? It is for the intermediate to advanced player who has an open mind, who is not held captive by rudiments and learning drum beats by rote. It's for the player who is ambitious enough to want to have their own voice on the instrument and not to merely play, learn things by rote that other drummers played before them. The only reason you should ever play something that another drummer played before you is because you want to. And a lot of times the situation arises where players will have a quite limited vocabulary of what they can do. And the things that I cover in the book in terms of both sticking patterns, how they can be applied musically, what it does two things, because if you think about it, when we're practicing the drums, whether we're aware of it or not, and largely I think people are not, we're working in two areas. One is facility-based practice, that's like hand and foot technique and coordination. And the other one is idiomatic practice, where you're doing things that are stylistically appropriate to be applied in certain musical situations. What I've done with the book is I've pulled those two things together so that you can develop your facility, but at the same time be coming up with stuff that's absolutely spot on to play in a funk groove, to play jazz comping. You can develop facility and develop idiomatically at the same time. You don't have to kind of say, okay, today, well, I'm just going to work on technique, and tomorrow I'll think about how I might apply that in a musical situation. You can do both at one time. And one of the things I like is being able to kind of combine these different practice disciplines, and it means that you get, if I do half an hour of practice with using this mindset, I can get as much benefit as other players would from 8 hours of practice. And practice is an investment, and just like any sort of investment, here we have a £10 note that I just happen to have alongside. You want to, you invest that, you want one of these back.
Yeah.
Why is this money on my desk? But your practice is exactly the same. You don't want to be spending like a week playing, very, very obscure hybrid flam rudiments, unless that's really, really what you want to do. Yes, it will finesse your technique a bit, but you've got to be thinking about context. You've got to be thinking about, what do I do? How does music work? What is the place of the drums in music? And looking at, focusing your attention to developing the things that you need to play with other people, and doing lots of technique stuff, and that can be very interesting and diverting. But it shouldn't, you know, I might, you know, if I want to do something like that, I might take one of the old great technique books, one of Wilcoxon or the Alan Dawson Rudimental Ritual, and I might do, you know, maybe just like 10 or 15 minutes with that. But I will try to take it to the drums and apply it as well, which reminds me, I had a new concept come to me while I was in the shower just before we all got together. And I'm just going to, excuse me for 1 moment, I'm just going to write it down on this pad.
Have you had lessons with Pete, Kira?
No, but I've seen you play, Pete, at a Hideaway and possibly somewhere else, I think.
Oh, yeah, because my sort of overriding memory, I had a couple of lessons with Pete a couple of years back to work on my brass technique, and his whole approach, the overriding thing, I came out of one of the lessons thinking, I can't do any of this, and then I went home and sat with it, and I mean that in a good way. It completely changed how I was thinking about phrasing and sticking, and you know, getting close and just kind of.
Well, yeah, a lot of that we were talking about then is in the book. It's something that means a great deal to me is simplification, demystification, and what the first section of the book is. You know, we've got two, you know, the standard two-armed human being, and there's only 12 elements that from which all stickings are derived, and you've got 4 of them: right, left, left, right, 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 left, left, that consist of 2 notes, and then there's another 8 that consist of 3 notes, and everything we play, you know, as I say, in the standard two-armed human being, is all composites of all that stuff. And you know, one of the here it's just out of, well, I'm not going to hold the stick control book up to the camera, but just imagine if I did, and it's something that every serious drummer owns or should. And one of the things I like to ask people is, how many of you have played the entire book? And this is the thing that sort of question that I'll put to the floor at drum camps and clinics, and nobody puts their hand up. And then I'll say, how many people have played the first 10 exercises on page 5? And then a few people would just quite meekly put their hand in there. I said, well, if you've played the first 10 exercises on page 5, actually, you have played the entire book, because everything else is just that reworked, even the flam stuff. The only difference will be when there's practice pad, just out of view. You can probably hear it. Would be like press rolls and things like that. But where sticking patterns are concerned, there are these 9 elements from which everything else comes. And then once you understand that and you combine them, and I do combine, there are a number of pages here's a typical example, it's like 16 note combinations. And the thing with them is they tend to be kind of almost lopsided, not very symmetrical, angular kind of permutations that I've come up with. Because they're much more akin to the kind of things that I do use when I'm actually improvising in real playing, rather than going paradiddle, paradiddle, paradiddle. You think about all the time you've spent, all the hours that you've clocked up, and doing, you know, repetitive things that you actually can already do, and nobody's ever phoned you up and said, hey, can you come out and do a gig, and I want you to play a paradiddle for like 5 minutes. So whilst there's a degree of benefit in terms of maintaining facility in your hands, where the music context is concerned, you're not really getting anywhere close. And so if I were to look at that, say, well, okay, and I'll give you a quick example of how I take the stickings and apply them in a musical context. So if I were to take that sticking, for instance, and say, okay, well, I can do that now, and I've done it for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and it's, my hands are coping with it fine. So now let's do something practical. What I then do is I put the right hand part in the bass drum.
Okay.
And the left hand part stays the same. So we're now getting this dialogue. We're getting the left hand and the right foot talking to one another, carrying out this musical conversation, which even though we don't have the luxury of all 12 tones of the chromatic scale at our disposal, you know yourself how the dialogue between the bass drum and the snare drum can sound very musical. So what I'll do is I'll then play that sticking between the hand and the foot, and then I'll introduce an ostinato. It could be something very just straight 8 notes, or it could be any of the standard 8th and 16th note permutations that we all know. So immediately you're doing a huge amount of work. You know, you've done a bit of technique. Now you put it in the hand foot thing, introduce the ostinato. So now you're staring down the barrel of this huge vista of independence and coordination. So this is a massive amount of facility that you're bringing into your playing right now. However, the problem with it is if you play that da, 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 in your hi-hat with all of those 16th notes in the snare drum and bass drum, it's too busy. It sounds too full. You wouldn't do it. It would lack the necessary musicality to sound like a good drum part. So what you do is you take the sequence of like right foot, left hand, right foot, left hand, right foot, left hand, and so on, whatever sticking you've chosen to do. And without deviating from that pattern, just stop playing some of them in the snare drum and the bass drum. And once it introduces magic quality of space, suddenly you've got this whole groove vocabulary just waiting for you behind that door that you didn't know was there until I showed it to you. You've got a lifetime of stuff that you can play and make your own. And I do make these, much as I like all the exercises and patterns that are presented in the book, the most important part of the content is the text. And anybody who's kind enough to invest in a copy of the book, I really, really stress how important it is to read what's going on. You know, read what I say. Otherwise, you won't get. You get about 30% of the benefit if you just jump in and look at the patterns. In fact, I'd even go so far as to say read all the text before you try to play anything, because you've got to understand why I said it. Because everything that's in there is in there for a reason. It's not just some kind of rudimental rehash that stuff that you've heard 1,000 times before. To me, it's a good book. I do believe it's a good book. I'm not going to be modest about it. I think I've done a pretty good job with it. But books like Teachers should never tell you to do something without a perfectly fully formed reason why they're telling you to do that.
Yeah.
It's like the old myth of practicing things slowly. And this is one of my favourite little tales and observations. Is that in the 1980s, neither one of you are old enough to remember what it was to be an adult drummer in the mid-1980s. In the 1980s, drummers the world over all suddenly started practicing everything at 40 BPM. And do you know why they did that?
No.
No. Well, I tell you why they did. Because Dave Weckl did 2 interviews, one in Downbeat magazine, another one in Modern Drummer magazine, where he talked about how he just spent a lot of time working on his playing by doing everything really, really, really slowly. And bear in mind that he was still a relatively young guy. He was 25 at the time. And drummers the world over had these 40 BPM headlights dazzle them. So they all went off and started practicing at 40 BPM, whether it was relevant to what they needed in their playing or not. And my thing with that is that, everybody knows about, but what I've said and kind of took it at face value and just kind of thought, oh, I've got to do that too. And to me, the idea, if you've got something that you want to play and you want to play it at 130 BPM, for example, what you need to do is to find where the baseline tempo is. And it might be 128. You might have to go all the way down to 98 or something. Find the baseline tempo where you can actually play it and make it sound pretty good, whatever it is you're attempting to do. Again, it's something I talk about in the book. I call it tempo of attainment. And once you've found where that tempo is, then you can speed it up. Then you can also slow it further down. But what you've got to do is, from a musical point of view, where you can play it and make it sound good, and also from a psychological and emotional point of view, where you tell yourself you're doing well. Think, yeah, hey, 112 BPM. It's not that far away, and tomorrow it's going to be a little bit closer. And this is all, as well as being, a good musical discipline. It's good kind of psychological preparation for playing as well. And also, if you think about it, if you've got some pattern that you want to play 138 that goes if you play it so slowly that you're going da 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 and so on, it's so different. The physical requirements are so different at that slower tempo. It's to the point where you're actually doing something else.
Yeah.
And you're not what you're trying to do at 130 BPM is not benefited at all by playing it at 40 BPM. You get very good at playing at 40 BPM, and it'll have some benefit for your ability to hold time and your time consciousness down in the basement of the metronome. But in terms of what the outcome that you're looking for, you're just going off at some complete tangent. And this is one of the great truths of drum tuition. I mean, you hear any drummer, tutor, clinician, they would say, practice things slowly. And the reason they tend to say that is because that's what their drum tutor said to them 20 or 30 years ago, or whatever. And they've never really taken the time to actually question that wisdom or look behind it. And yeah, of course, there's merit in practicing stuff slowly. But to me, the true merit in practicing things slowly is that what you then do when you're practicing slowly is you find a baseline tempo where you can, and this is really important, where you can think and play at the same speed. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And we've all read things about certain drummers whose names and achievements are the stuff of legend. And people say, they always say things like, he could play anything he could think of, or he could play completely in the moment. As if to, and bear in mind that those kind of words tend to get written by people who are not professional drummers and are often not drummers at all. They're music journalists. And some good drummers are music journalists, and some good music journalists are good drummers. But you have to bear in mind that where you're sourcing your information from. We don't fact check in the drum world quite as much as perhaps we should. Maybe we need a little bit more vigilance in that. But the point of playing slowly is to get the processing speed up here locked in with where your hands are at. And I found this out years and years ago, back in the 90s, when I found myself playing licks on gigs because I could rather than because I should. I was just getting really angry with myself. And without it affecting my work diary or saying anything to anybody at the time, I went away quietly back to my flat in Elstree, where I used to live at the time, and basically taught myself to play all over again. And it didn't hold me back. It didn't stop me working. But what I wanted from it, and I might have been wasting my time. What I wanted from it was that it liberated me from muscle memory. Yeah. And people talk about muscle memory. Muscle memory is great if you're an athlete. If you're going to do exactly the same thing every day, it might be like throwing a javelin or running 100 meters. Muscle memory is great for that. I don't want to do the same thing any 2 days at all. And muscle memory is the kind of thing that you get if you play the same West End show 8 times a week for 2 years without hardly any time off. And you know, it's not really as tapped into the spirit of creativity that personally I'm looking for from music. That is maybe really what we're after. So I'd say if you want to throw a javelin or a discus, I'm doing all the track and field actions, which, you know, people watching this are thinking, hey, you know, Pete's done that and we've forgotten that they've cancelled the Olympics. So, you know, I like to help. So if you're doing the same repeated physical act every day, then fine. But, you know, we don't want to do that. And often the things that we're repeating on a daily basis are actually making our playing worse. Because if you've got bad habits, you know, I see so many bad habits of technique, of posture, of coordination, all the, you know, any drum tutor that sees all the time. And if you do them for long enough, they become imprinted. Then it takes a moment to, it's much harder to unlearn this stuff than it is to get it right the first time. But coming back to the thinking and playing at the same speed, I started to do that, and I would take patch and syncopation. So I could think right hand, left hand, single stroke, double stroke. And I got to a point where I could think and play at the same speed. And like with anything, once I could do that really slowly, I started to push it. And I've got to the point now where I can do it at really, really very... There are a couple of subdivisions, and I'm not really where I'd like to be, like improvising in 8th notes at upward of about 280 BPM. That's one area that I would still want to level that up. But there are certain ranges where I can think and play completely at the same time. Because these are the drummers that I like the most. And I don't care who it is. This is not a style thing. This is not an era thing. This is not a chops thing. The drummers I like the most are the ones who can think the fastest, not the ones who can play the fastest.
Yeah. That's such a good point.
You know, you think about
just sorry to cut you off quickly. We've got about 3 minutes left on the meeting, so just quickly, do you want to tell people where they can get your book, how they can get hold of your book, and
yeah, absolutely. It is on. If you search for it on eBay, you'll find it. I've got a little package deal going with my DVD as well. That's still running on eBay. Okay. Or you can visit my website, which is www.petecater.org, and you can order it through the store page on there. Either way. One good thing I have noticed with the everything kind of on go slow at the moment, post is getting through really quickly. I sent 3 of them I think it was last Monday afternoon, second class. One of them was in Northern Ireland first thing the following morning.
Wow.
So
now's the time to order then.
Yeah, there you go.
Cool.
Oh yeah. Or order now to avoid disappointment.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Pete.
It's been great. We you know, it's I think people should be really getting into this. You know, we're on like Zoom meeting. Amazing house party is suddenly everywhere that nobody had heard of a week ago. Yeah. Do you think that's been developed by Huawei or somebody?
Oh,
yeah. Comes the virus, comes the $1 billion app right behind it.
Yeah.
Say that. We're listening to right now.
Thanks so much.
I think this whole it's great, and you know, just thanks for the hang and communicating and allowing me to talk about this wonderful instrument that we all love and share so much with. And you know, even if people watching, even if you don't want to buy a book, just come and if you've got some questions anytime, particularly while I'm here with enforced leisure time, just hit me up on the socials, and if you want to ask about something, then do, and I'll get back to you. Right. It's just nice to be in touch with people.
Thank you.
And just think. I've got one thing I've got to say. Just think how amazing it's going to be when this all finishes. Everybody's going to want to go to gigs.
Yeah.
I hope so.
And make sure you do. Go and support your pals who play, and they'll come and support you right back. But we're supporting each other in the lockdown with the buying of books and all the YouTube subscriptions and things like that.
Yeah.
But don't forget when it comes back. And I don't mean go and spend 200 quid to be in row 150 of a sports arena. Go to a small venue. Go to a 500-seat theatre.
Yeah.
Go to an art centre. Go to a club. Go to a pub. You know, let's take back control of the music industry.
Totally.
Cool. That's a good place to end it. Thanks so much, Pete.
I think so.
Thank you.
See you soon. Take care, guys. Be well. Stay safe.